Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Speak Up for Blue podcast. It is Ocean Talk Friday. As you know, it's my favorite day of the week. Not only because it's Friday and it's the end of the week, but I get to talk to my good friend Nathan Johnson about all the wonderful things and not so wonderful things happening in the ocean so that we can make you guys aware of what's happening, what we need to do about it, and what people are actually doing about it. So lots of great topics today. It's funny, a lot of the articles that we got are actually fused in and related. So it's going to be a good topic on some UN stuff that's going on and an international treaty for the high seas. That's going to be the focus of our talk today. So I'm really looking forward to it. As you know, this continues on and on through our Facebook community. We have a really strong Facebook community that likes to talk and likes to continue the conversations that happen here in the podcast. Go back to the Facebook group at speakupforblue.com/group. You can. All you have to do is request. It's free to join. I add you in when I see that a request is added, and we have a great time. Actually, it's funny because sometimes we'll address something, like we'll introduce something in the podcast, talk about it in the Facebook group, and then I address it again in the podcast again. So you don't want to lose out on any of the conversations. Go to speakupforblue.com/group, join the group, become active, become a marine conservationist, and if you're an ocean scientist, just join the conversation. It's awesome. Let's get started. Let's start the show. If you are sick of hearing of the doom and gloom of the ocean and not knowing what to do, you're in the right place. If you want to meet people working to protect the ocean, then you are in the right place. If you want to find out how you can get involved in protecting the ocean, then you are in the right place. This is the Speak Up for Blue podcast, and I am here to empower you to live for a better ocean. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the Speak Up for Blue podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, founder, speakupforblue.com, marine ecologist, and self-proclaimed oceanpreneur. And the more I talk, the more I sound like Barry White. It's unbelievable how my voice just keeps going and going and going. I actually feel better today, but my voice doesn't sound like I feel better today. But I'm recording this back on Wednesday. So hopefully by the time this airs, I'll feel better and my voice will be a lot better to continue on with some of these conversations. But we got Nate to help me out with the podcast today. Nate, how you doing?
I'm doing better than you.
Thanks, man. That hurt. That hurt my throat, not the comment. I'm glad to have you back. You're going to have to do most of the talking, my friend, although you know me, I'll always chime in. But how have you been?
I've been good.
Right on. It's been a nice summer here so far. It's like 28 degrees Celsius here. It's humid, but it's a lot of fun. How's it down in Texas? Is it yucky yet?
It's about 28 Fahrenheit. It's a nice, chilly, brisk, snow-filled summer down here in Texas. It's like mid-90s.
Yeah, that's what I figured. I was like 28 degrees Fahrenheit. I was like, that is pretty cold. I'm sure we would have heard about it. I'm sure that would have been our topic of conversation today.
Yeah, everyone down here just stays inside next to like a fan or an air conditioner.
Oh, I can imagine. The people who service, like the HVAC people who service air conditioners must be like going around the clock.
I would imagine so, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty good. Because you guys get the humidity as well, right?
Yeah, down in Houston we do.
Yeah. I guess over on the west side, it's more desert.
Much drier out there, yeah.
That's interesting in one state how it changes like that. All right, cool. You ready to chat about what's going on for today?
Let's do it.
All right, let's start it off.
All right, so we're going to start first in the Bay of Bengal, down in the Indian Ocean area, and we're going to talk about a lot of the nutrient pollution and runoff that the area is experiencing, and this is part of another larger story that we'll talk about later. But a group of marine scientists from the University of Oxford have put together basically a compilation of reports, and one of the findings that they compiled in that report was detailed the Bay of Bengal and how the nutrient levels in the bay are almost at a tipping point for the entire bay ecosystem. So, or surrounding the Bay of Bengal in India, there's a good amount of agriculture and farmland. And what you have right now is a lot of farmers or people living off the land that use nitrogen-heavy fertilizers. They'll basically coat their land in fertilizers to help with production. But then anytime it rains, you get all of that nitrogen from the fertilizer running off into ultimately the bay, into intermediate rivers or other waterways prior to that. But all of this nitrogen and all of this fertilizer is ending up in the Bay of Bengal. And so the problem there is that nitrogen acts as a fertilizer not only to terrestrial plants, but also to algae in the water. So it stimulates a lot of this algal growth. And then as these new algae die, as they break down and fall to the bottom of the bay or of the water column, the bacteria that decompose the algae consume a lot of oxygen. So basically the situation you have is as more nitrogen or fertilizer runs off into waterways, you typically see at first a spike in algae, a lot of algal blooms, and then you have a sharp decrease once all that algae dies in oxygen. And it's a natural system to some degree, but when you have a stimulant like nitrogen that encourages such rapid algal growth, you have then such large amounts of decomposition when that algae dies, which means the normal oxygen this bacteria typically would use up is compounded, and it's exponentially larger than under normal circumstances, which means there's significantly less oxygen in that system than there typically would be. So that seems to be facing the Bay of Bengal right now. You have really sharp drops in oxygen levels, which impact obviously the rest of the marine life and the bay life in that area that needs oxygen to survive. And the other issue here is that you could have the potential for this oxygen depleted or oxygen absent water, even in some cases, mixing with the rest of the ocean. Because you get that exchange between bays and oceans, any pollutants or contaminants or hypoxic waters that are in the bay have the potential to also influence the ocean further out. So it's not just something that's isolated to the Bay of Bengal. And the other interesting thing about this story is that, some people might think that this, because of where it's located, doesn't really apply if you live in a Western country or, in the Americas or Western Europe, because we don't, at least typically, identify the Bay of Bengal as having a direct impact on our lives. But this is a problem that really impacts any sort of coastal waterway when you have a lot of essentially development. It doesn't even necessarily have to be agriculture. A lot of people use fertilizers on their lawns too. So in suburban areas or, heavily populated regions, you tend to have a lot of nitrogen runoff also. I know down here in Houston and Galveston Bay, we do see nitrogen spikes and drops in oxygen after heavy rains during certain times of the year. And I know in other areas of the U.S., nitrogen runoff and fertilizers are becoming a huge issue. Some places are even regulating how much nitrogen can be in fertilizer when you sell it, so that you don't have this issue, even if that fertilizer ends up washing into the waterways. So it's a really important thing to be aware of, because it's probably happening in a place close to where you live if you live on the coast. And it has far-reaching impacts, and it goes beyond just a single bay or a single waterway. All of this is connected, and it's also something that folks can really easily, on an individual level, take a stand against. You can simply use less fertilizer, or if you need to use fertilizer, try and reduce the amount of nitrogen in that specific fertilizer. There's a lot of other options besides just heavy inorganic nitrogen based fertilizers.
Yeah, I mean, it's we've seen these before. We've seen this type of nutrient runoff before. We've seen bays in trouble before. But the good news is, and I know it sounds depressing to probably a lot of our audience members, but the good news is it can be fixed. And it doesn't take much to fix a water system like that. I mean, if you look at New York Harbor, New York Harbor was horrible back in the day. Where the menhaden were gone, the fish were gone, and you couldn't, the whales left because the menhaden left, and now all of a sudden we're seeing an increase in humpback sightings, whale sightings, because the menhaden have come back because the water quality got better. And it came through regulation and through government regulations that wouldn't allow businesses and people to essentially pour in harmful substances that will cause this type of thing. And that's what's really needed here, because businesses aren't going to do it on their own. It has to be done by people who, like, it has to be done by a government from a top down kind of point of view, with the understanding that people realize that, hey, look, this is our bay. It's a pretty big bay. If you look it up on a map, I mean, it's a pretty major bay. It's not just like a small little inlet kind of thing. This is a pretty big bay that can affect, which we're going to talk about in a bit, high seas. And I think it's necessary that we really look at this and realize that in India, the population is huge. So there's going to be a lot more effects and a lot faster. But the other good thing is, once things get fixed and once regulations get put in, because it's such a high population, you're going to see the effects go back on a positive note faster as well. Just because as long as people adhere to the regulations, you're going to see something good come out of it. And I think that's where it really comes down to, is regulation from the government. Because like I said before, we've seen stuff like this happen. And coming back to the U.S., we see it in the Gulf of Mexico, you know, where the Mississippi River gets so bad at times that the area where there's a hypoxic zone, meaning no oxygen on the bottom layer, is massive. It can span like square kilometers like you wouldn't believe.
Yeah, it's growing too every year.
Exactly.
And
that gets regulated, right? Like every year, the government, whether they want to or not, and whether farmers want to or not, all the way up the Mississippi River, they go and they regulate the fertilizer and pesticide use.
And there's a growing push also, at least in the U.S. on a state level, to regulate the sale of types of fertilizer. So I know in certain areas in the U.S. and certain states, I want to say mostly on the West Coast, they have essentially caps on how much nitrogen or phosphorus can be in fertilizers. And I think in order to, purchase fertilizers with higher concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus, you have to, have a permit, or you have to go through all this licensing. So at least in the U.S., that seems to be becoming more and more recognized as an issue.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that, because, I think there's been a lot of studies on it in that area in the States, and I think that's good. The more studies I've done, the more we know, the more we can do something about it. So that's good to hear that something's being done. And here in Ontario, not many people are happy about it, but we're not allowed to use specific fertilizers because they're worried about what it's going to do to the environment. They're also worried what it's going to do to the health environment because of the pesticides. But most of it's based on trying to fix the nitrate problem, the nutrient problems in the Great Lakes around here in Ontario. So that is one way of doing it, is one way of battling, is looking at the fertilizer use. And we talked with Rob Moyer, at IMCC and on this podcast about what he's doing in Florida and how he's working with people in Florida to say, hey, look, along your coast at certain times of the year, you get a huge nutrient problem, and it stinks. It smells like dead people, apparently. And it's obviously homeowners don't want it. So, that he came up with a number of ways that the county people, the people in the counties, in the different counties in Florida, can actually work to help reduce their footprint, their nutrient footprint in the environment. And now it's implemented countywide, or most counties in Florida. That's a great way to sort of get some action done, because one, people can see the results, almost right away,
right,
within a season. And I think that's really important. So if you connect with people and show why it's needed, and show examples of what it can do when it's done, when it's implemented successfully, then you're looking at a pretty cool, like a pretty good management system and a pretty good awareness campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the more closed a system is, the quicker you'll see a problem if there is a problem, but also the quicker you'll be able to address and alleviate that problem.
Right.
So, for example, like it's pretty straightforward in rivers and streams to manage fish populations if it's a relatively closed system, because you can tell right away if the fish are dying, and you can easily put in strategies to increase recruitment. Bays are a little bit more complicated because they're not necessarily a closed system, and they're larger typically than lakes and rivers and streams. And then oceans are a whole nother thing. So, even though the Bay of Bengal it's the largest bay in the world, it's still compared to the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, the Pacific, it's a relatively enclosed area and a closed system. So you do have, there's the possibility to do something about it quicker than it would if it were to spread, if these hypoxic zones were to spread further out into the Indian Ocean. So, it's one of those where the sooner you can catch it and the sooner you can do something, the better off you'll be.
Yeah, absolutely. And the challenge is it's a government system. So it may not be as fast as everybody hopes it would be. Plus, you're dealing with large populations. Right?
Yeah.
That's the other challenge. And I think that's where it becomes a little more difficult in that respect. But there are a lot of success stories with this kind of thing. And I think that helps. And I think we need to really focus on that. And hopefully the people of India will remember that when they have to implement these kind of restrictions. And they'll have to go through stakeholder consultations, of course, but I think it'll be worthwhile to get it done. But it's going to take some time, right? It's going to take some time, and I think it might even hopefully it won't take too long to convince the people that this is the right way, because you know how a lot of people don't like change and whatnot. I think this is going to be one of those things where it's like, if you can see if you can get the people to believe in you, believe in what you're doing, then I think you'll see a lot of change, and I think you'll see change faster than you think. I think it's a great opportunity to see a good win and a quick win implemented.
Yeah.
So that's good. Let's move on to the next story, which kind of mentions this story as well, and is kind of related to our next one. So I think we'll maybe put it all into one. Yeah,
we normally do 4 stories. I sort of skimmed the stories at first, and when reading them, I found out that there's actually 3 stories. So you're getting a really special episode.
It's a themed episode. Episode.
So we're going to rope the next 2 stories together. So I said earlier that the report that identified the Bay of Bengal as reaching a tipping point was part of a larger compilation of studies and research and reports by some folks from the University of Oxford. That report, which specifically looked at 271 studies that have all been done in the last 5 years, so since 2012, was meant for the United Nations it's called a preparatory committee, which has been meeting, I think, for the last 2 years. They've been meeting for the last few years. I think this is their 4th meeting, which is currently ongoing. It's supposed to wrap up, July 21st. So, so on Friday, when you hear this, should be the last day. Basically, that prep committee's goal, or one of their goals, is to try and figure out a way to internationally govern the high seas, which is that area of the ocean that's past each country's exclusive economic zone, more than 200 nautical miles from the shoreline. Those areas are not governed by a specific country. And in the past, while there's, I believe there's some sort of treaties in place to at least put some basic guidelines in there for what you can and can't do on the high seas, it's pretty much just its own mess. It's not very well enforced. The rules, if they are there, aren't very specific. And there's, as more countries move towards protecting parts of the ocean, they're starting to realize that eventually we're going to figure out what to do with these parts of the ocean that aren't governed by a specific country. And so you can't really just have the United States or Canada or India say, you can do this, but not that. You have to come to some sort of international agreement. So that's what the prep committee's job is. And they're hoping that with this last meeting, they can produce recommendations that they can bring to the then General Assembly for the UN to figure out, okay, how are we going to put forth a treaty or some sort of government structure? So they're basically trying to recommend to the rest of the UN, this is how we think you should do it, and we should start working on this now. So that report basically highlighted a lot of the severe risks facing the ocean right now to climate change, overfishing, deep sea mining, farming, and plastic pollution. And it specifically focused a lot on these threats to the high seas, where you typically have less protection and less management there. So, a lot of the researchers that compiled these reports and members of the prep committee on the UN and other folks like DiCaprio, Richard Branson, other, big name people who support ocean protection are really calling for the UN and international governments to start to do something about this. Answer specific questions like, how can countries collaborate to develop MPAs on the high seas? How, if we want to protect an area, how do we do that if it's past our exclusive economic zone? So again, this is all still kind of in the early stages, but what the couple articles from Pew and phys.org mention is that we're kind of at the end of the early stages. This committee has been meeting for a while. This is supposed to be the last meeting. While we're certainly not at a point yet where we say we have a structure in place and that governments are on board to participate in, at some point you've got to start making progress. And I think that's where we're at right now. So there's a lot of enthusiasm and promise that this committee will actually, recommend something to the UN. But then again, it's the UN. They only have so much enforcement ability for these types of things. And so you kind of just have to wonder, while it's certainly better than nothing, how much teeth will what they recommend actually have from an enforcement standpoint? How much will it incentivize countries to work together on these types of things? Which I'm sure are all questions that the committee is trying to answer. But it's hard to envision a situation that's more complicated than managing the high seas, where you don't have, not only do you have, international politics probably playing a role in which countries will work together, you also have just the sheer size of this, of the surface that we're trying to protect. So, it seems like this is one of many ways that, these parties can work towards something, but I would imagine this is going to be a very long, iterative, and difficult set of regulations or structures to get in place.
Yeah, if you think about how long it took countries to agree on climate change and to actually do something about climate change, and that was really only because the world was watching, and it made, the press made such a big thing to do about it.
And some are still,
and some we're not going to name who.
Still haven't pulled their weight on that.
Yeah, still haven't pulled their weight on. And to be honest, it's still not even a legal sort of document. It's just more of a guideline,
right.
A voluntary guideline. So, but some still pull out of a voluntary.
It's Canada.
Voluntary agreement. Yeah, we're talking about Canada, aren't we? But yeah, I mean, you're talking about the UN here. You're talking about the high seas. These are complex issues, and you have to get governments that are within the UN to agree. And that's not even counting the governments outside the UN. So, even if they do agree, and this has been so far a 10-year process in the making. So that's quite a long time. Even with that, you're still going to have complications, because even if countries agree to it, it doesn't mean that local people are going to agree to it, because they're going to eat, right? If they want to fish to eat, they're going to eat. They're going to fish, no matter what the guideline says. Even if they're going to be labeled a criminal or whatever, they got to feed their family. That's what they're going to do first. Mm-hmm. It's very, like you mentioned, it's very difficult to enforce the high seas. Who's got jurisdictions? There's no UN, peacekeeping army that's going to partake in this. It's all going to be individual countries that are going to foot the bill for this kind of stuff. And, when you have to do that, it becomes difficult. When you just figure out who's going to do it, then you got the fact of how you're going to do it. I know we've talked about this before. Satellites can help, but they're not always real time. Mm-hmm. Planes can help, but that's very expensive. Are the countries going to put up this kind of money to make sure that the high seas are going to put in, are going to be protected? It's a difficult response, because people, we haven't been able to do it so far. Even though there's been a lot of pressure, there's been a lot of work done by many organizations that have tried to regulate the high seas or have tried to figure something out for the high seas. But it's difficult when nobody really has any ownership, but also everybody, it's like a free fall for all out there. You got these tankers. I'm thinking fishing most of all. You got these tankers, these massive tankers that are almost bigger than cruise ships, that can hold, more fish than they can people, that cruise ships can handle. you're looking at some devastating effects that could be going on right now. We don't even know about it. Then you got the other fact of the human rights issue of people from all over the world in developed countries working in basically slavery conditions on the high seas in today's world, and trying to make a living of whatever they can, being tossed overboard whenever they're sick or not working. It's a rough world on the high seas, and there's a lot of illegal activity going on because it's so hard to regulate. And so I think enforcement's gonna be a big part of it. They talk about biodiversity and protecting biodiversity, and that's extremely important. But it's gonna be hard to enforce, and I don't know what they're planning on doing. I don't know if they're gonna have a UN sort of army that are made up of different countries that are going to enforce this kind of stuff. Because right now, the only people that are enforcing it are Sea Shepherd and maybe Greenpeace, right? And they can't be everywhere. So it becomes difficult. What are your thoughts on this? Like, do you find this worthwhile, or do you find this just sort of an action that, hey, the UN's trying to do something, but in the end, they won't be able to do it?
Well, I mean, I don't have I feel like this is one of those things where if you're inside these talks and you're connected with the people who are trying to put this together, this situation, I would imagine, is completely different than from the outside looking in. Because, from the outside looking in, it's just these groups are talking about what they can do. And that seems very straightforward. Like, even though the issue itself is certainly not simple, a bunch of people sitting together in a room talking about how are we going to implement this seems more or less like, a good, productive endeavor to carry out. So given that fact that I don't really know what's going on behind closed doors, like what are the sticking points, what are people hung up on, what are people particularly excited about, what's currently going on, and what could be going on in the future, I think that this is a good idea simply because I don't know of any other option. I have not heard of any other realistic scenario for protecting the high seas short of a UN treaty or some sort of UN sanctioned list of recommendations, which itself is not perfect, as we've talked about a lot before. But there's really no other way that I can think of, short of maybe, throwing in some sort of economic or like private sector incentives to protecting the high seas, just because of how international this question is. And so you either, I think, have to go a diplomatic government side, which would be the UN, or you'd go with a private market-based side, which is just, individual companies that themselves are global or have global connections can get into it. And, probably there's something that both can do to contribute, but I don't see a whole lot of high-profile, businesses jumping in saying, we're going to make it our priority to protect the high seas. So I don't see another somewhat realistic option. And so I'd be hesitant to say this is not worth it because we don't know. And maybe despite how slow and at times fickle and unable to enforce these things, that, unable to sort of give it the teeth that we want, the UN can only do so much. Despite all of that, maybe something will come of this. I think the fact that they're talking is certainly not a bad idea. If there was a better option on the table and they were doing this, then I might say, yeah, that's just a waste of time. But I don't know of a better option.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's one of those things that have to be done. But I also find that I don't see a resolution coming quickly. And that's probably why it's been in for 10 years. But a lot of people put some great work into it. And I think eventually it's better than nothing. Right. I agree. And we have to start somewhere. And, that was maybe my pessimism earlier, thinking, hey, we need to, is this really going to work? But we need to start somewhere. And we can't learn unless we make mistakes, and we can't learn unless we, put forth a strategy and say, okay, well, this worked in this situation, but didn't work in situation B. So let's figure out how to make it work in both A and B. And then we'll worry about situation C and do it sort of as a, an adaptive management sort of process, an iterative process. And I think I think that's the way to go about it, and we got to just continue on, man. We got to keep going with these types of strategies and show how it's important. I think really what we really need to do is show it how important it is, sort of in people's eyes, because I still don't know if people get how important biodiversity is and protecting marine biodiversity.
Yeah,
I don't see that people see the direct, the sort of the direct connection between us and biodiversity in the high seas.
Yeah, I think, most people, if you ask them on the street, would say that sure, biodiversity is important. But I think when you have them rank that with a lot of other things that probably more directly impact them, like, things like job security, education, poverty, all that stuff. And I'm not saying biodiversity should top all of those, but those are all much more immediate needs that people can more easily support with donations or with their votes and things like that. And biodiversity is just always one of those other things that's sort of like, yeah, it'd be good to have. But I'm not going to go out of my way right now to make sure that I change my lifestyle for it. Or I'm not going to go out of my way to call a representative for biodiversity reasons. That I think is where it falls short on the list. And to your point, I don't think it would help for folks to be unrealistically naive about this initiative. Like, I think it's a good strategy, but I think, like you're saying, you absolutely have to be very cognizant of how this could fail, or how this could succeed, and just what are the limits that this has to even make any change. Because a UN treaty probably isn't going to solve everything, even if it's perfectly implemented and abided by. So, I think while you're doing this, you also have to be cognizant of, here are the ways that this could stall and break down, and what can we do in advance to stop that from happening. But then even if we do, here are the things that are still not going to be addressed. And is there anything that maybe not the UN, but maybe individual groups of countries or leaders within certain countries can do to address those issues?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so much to do at that level and internationally. It would be really good to see for countries to report on everything that they're trying to do and what their priorities are. I think that would be kind of cool for the public to see, and sort of where are countries really pushing for protections? What are the challenges each country's facing, and how are they pushing it forward to address them in this treaty? I think that would be something that would be pretty cool. I don't even know if we can do that. I think dedicated reporters would probably need to do that to get access to that information, and have time to put that information into play. But I think that would be kind of cool to see, hey, all these countries signed on to the Paris Agreement. But what are they doing for marine biodiversity? Is it just climate change? Are they just doing it to, not be ostracized from the community? Like some G20 or G19 countries? Or do we need to fall in line, or do we just go out on our own and figure out our own way to do this? Obviously, it's one of those resolutions and treaties that take a group effort, and it's necessary. So it'll be interesting to see how this comes to play. I think it's July 21st. You said is the last day.
Yes.
Of these meetings.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see what happens after that, and what the results are of this meeting, and how many more meetings they need to actually put something into place. But I think it's a pretty cool thing. Do you have any last things to say on that?
No, just that hopefully something happens from it.
Yeah, seriously.
Hopefully we can just continue to get small victories after small victories, and then maybe a big victory will be there.
That's a great point. I'd love to see them come out with some small tangible result that they can implement right away, and then build on that. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, it helps to have some sort of early momentum, even if it's just small, so that everyone involved, or even the supporters who aren't involved, say like, okay, at least they're getting something done.
Yeah.
And we can sort of ride that wave till the next, hopefully larger victory.
Exactly. And I think that's a great way of doing it, because at least it shows that these meetings are worthwhile, and that they're actually, thinking about implementing things. And of course they have to be careful of what they implement and to make sure that it works. But those are great. You can call them pilot studies and then show, what happens, and then integrate another something else into it, and then something else, and build on that.
Right.
I think that's where we're looking at some strong results that could either succeed or fail. Even if it fails, at least we're putting something together that shows they're doing something. I think that would be interesting to see.
Yeah.
So, all right, let's move on to the last story. We're going to talk about the movie Chasing Coral that was just released this week or I guess last week on Netflix. Why don't you describe it? Because I've seen the movie on Netflix. I highly recommend anybody that wants to watch it to watch it. Obviously, it's free if you have a Netflix account. And we're going to post the trailer to it in the show notes. But why don't you describe it, Nathan, in what it does in the article that you read?
So you mentioned when we were talking about the high seas that a lot of people just don't know or appreciate the importance of biodiversity. And I think that's actually probably one of the main messages of the film Chasing Coral. I haven't seen it. I've heard a lot about it. The article itself is on NPR. It was published just a few days ago, and it basically follows and covers the work of a prior advertising exec named Richard Vavers. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that name right.
Sounds right.
It could be Ricard. I'm not sure. But he decided a few years back to, get out of the advertising game and focus on ocean conservation. It was something that he felt was, under-addressed, under-supported, and he thought basically that it was an advertising problem, that conservationists or policymakers or researchers just hadn't found a good way to convince the public that this was worth their time and energy and money to protect. So he thought he could take his skills in advertising and apply them to coral conservation, which is a great idea. And he is sort of the focus of this documentary. Basically, it follows him and his crew, and they get images and videos of coral reefs and habitats throughout the world that are suffering bleaching, and they're trying to raise awareness about how dangerous coral bleaching is. They talk about what it is, how it not only can damage the ecosystems, but also, the physical structure of the reefs themselves, which provide a lot of protection and habitat for coastal areas. And then, on top of that, the tourism dollars that can be lost from unhealthy or unproductive reefs. They go into how, bleaching is largely caused by temperature increases, which is directly tied to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions and all of that. It was directed by the same person who directed the Chasing Ice documentary about climate change, so it has kind of that same feel and style to it. One of the things that this article on NPR kind of laments is how it was originally shown when it was premiered to a bunch of people at a coral reef symposium, which is great, but at the same time, those are probably the last people who need to see this documentary. This, I imagine, was meant for just the average person or the person who doesn't particularly care or know that much about coral reefs, which, I think is who it should absolutely be directed at. But if that's the case, maybe, I don't know. I find it hard to sort of rag on them for portraying it or premiering it at a coral reef symposium, considering it's on Netflix and anyone with a Netflix account can watch it. But I think what it was meant to do is to bring awareness and a sense of urgency to the issue of coral bleaching, and especially mass bleaching events that we've been seeing over the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, it made some pretty big headlines on the web and, through social media and stuff like that. For my newsfeed anyway. I saw it everywhere. I saw advertisements for it. I saw people who had colleagues in it that would be in it, that would be talking about it. It made a lot of splash, so I was looking forward to seeing it, and I was happy with what it covered. I think it's a great movie to show anybody who is not familiar about what climate change is doing or what's happening to the reefs right now. Right? I think it's showing, especially over the last 3 years, we've seen a large change in global temperatures, and with that, we've seen a reduction in coral cover because of bleaching, and of course other things, but mostly bleaching. This is a serious event, and I think it was kind of interesting. The whole movie really predicated itself on this photographer who used to be a marketer, was actually an underwater diver, well, I guess scuba diver, of course, it's underwater. But he was an underwater photographer and videographer as a hobby, and then of course became it professionally. And what he wanted to do was, the idea of the story, from what I gather, was he was going to go to the different places around the world, into different reef spots, and basically take 360 video to update the Google Earth layer, the Google Ocean layer, so that, like right now, if you can actually go underwater in Google Earth, you can actually go underwater and look at specific spots in Hawaii and all over the place and see pictures of reefs and all that kind of stuff. Well, now the idea with this project was you could actually see pictures, but also do video. So 360 videos, so you can look all the way around, which is kind of a cool thing. On this journey, they realized that, there's going to be bleaching and whatnot. And this photographer wanted him and his crew to document the changes that were happening to the reefs. And they did a good job doing it. They showed a lot of sort of the technology that was going behind it, how it's, quote unquote, it's never really been done before. What they wanted to do is have a time series, so have a camera on the reefs at different spots around the world, and that would take images at a specific time during the day, or during different times during the day. And then they would put it in the water. So they built a casing. The camera had to be hooked up to a tether so that you can see it's actually working, and so forth. And then they had difficulty with it. The first batch, it was out of focus all the time, so they said they couldn't use it. And so it kind of went back and forth on how the technology wasn't working, and they needed to come up with something different. Then they just abandoned that, and they just took divers and went out every day. This is on Lizard Island and another island in Australia on the Great Barrier Reef, and they went every day to 25 to 50 dive sites a day to document the changes. So they would take a photograph or even take a 2-minute video, and they would in the same spot every day, so you can document the changes. And then at the end, they took that information and they brought it to a coral reef symposium in Australia, and they showed it to them. They also premiered the movie there afterwards, but they showed what the images that they were seeing. And I agree with you to a certain point. It was like you're preaching to the choir. But I think the information was valuable at the time because they were going, especially Australia, the Great Barrier Reef was going through such a bleaching event. It was good to have everybody together and show these images that were very drastic and very dramatic. I mean, you see the people who were taking these videos and photographs were crying. Grown men crying because they're seeing firsthand the detriment of the Great Barrier Reef, and especially in certain spots. So, from a movie standpoint, a documentary standpoint, it was really cool. They told the story about how hard it is to work in the ocean and take photographs and images automatically, and then how hard it is for someone to dive in there and do it every day for 25 to 50 sites and watch, coral change for in a negative way. And they showed how difficult it was. And I think it's good to show what's happening to the reefs. At the end of the movie, where they usually put their hopeful and their action plan together, really they just showed a video of those same researchers going to schools and presenting and showing the images and doing like a virtual reality of a reef and sort of educating kids, which is important. Mm-hmm. Right? It's always important to educate the next generation. But what I feel that this movie failed to do, it was good at bringing about awareness of an important topic, but it never gave the action at the end. What could everybody do at the end of that video? They said go to chasingcoral.com and you can pledge that you're going to do something about it. And there's a couple things that you can do on there, but they never really focused it on the movie, where you have everybody captivated. Like, you've done a great job at getting everybody depressed and everybody sad of what's happening.
Right.
And people are like, they're almost to the point where they're at their angry parts. Like, what can we do? I want to do something. What can I do? And then you just let it go. And you don't say what you can do. And I think that's really bad. The other thing that I didn't realize until today, one of the friends of the podcast, Angelo Villagomez, put out a review, sort of a quick review on a post, saying that one thing they didn't say is they never interviewed or looked at local community people, how their lives are changed because of the bleaching. What they think, how it's affecting their culture, their socioeconomic standpoints, right? How it's affecting their lives. They talk about how tourism is such an important part of reefs, and how reefs are an important part of tourism, and how people depend on the fish for food, for a protein source from reefs, and they give a percentage and whatnot. But they never actually go through and interview any locals and how it's affecting them, right? That's where the real action comes in, right? And show how other people are dealing with this right now. That's where I think it could have gone. Instead of focusing more than half the movie on getting these cameras to work automatically and then saying, you know what, screw it, we're just going to do it manually. And that took 45 minutes at least, right? It felt like that was the narrative of the story, of the movie. Instead of, the narrative should have been, this is what's happening to the reefs for the first maybe 20 minutes. And then instead of going to researchers and preaching to the choir, let's go to local communities and let's see how we can help. Let's see what people are doing to try and adapt. How is it affecting culture? How is it affecting the economy in these local economies? How is it affecting people? The fishing communities, tourism, recreational tourism, scuba divers, kayakers, hotels, right? Mm-hmm. How is it affecting them, and what are they doing to help out? That's where the message should have gone. And I feel that that's where the movie failed. But I still think it succeeded in making people aware. But the people, in our group, in our Facebook group, somebody said, hey, I just watched Chasing Coral. Whoever's watched it, what are your thoughts? And everybody said, great movie, depressed the hell out of me, didn't give them any action. They didn't know what to do. So we had to have a full conversation on there of what to do. And I think that's where science communicators around the world who have seen this movie is to use the popularity of this movie right now, and to use it to put in action items. I think that's where we really need to focus, and also build on the story. Build on the story of how it's affecting local communities. And I feel that that's where it needs to be. Unfortunately, it wasn't done in the movie where you actually had a captivated audience. Yeah. That's the one part that didn't come in. And I still feel like these movies happen all the time. A lot of people said it was just like Chasing Ice. Mm-hmm. It was the same thing. It was all about the technology and how they did it, which is a cool story. And I understand you have to do that story, but what about the story of how it's affecting people?
Right.
That's where the story that's where the drama is.
If you're trying to tug at people's heartstrings, some folks might really like coral enough to be totally engaged with protecting them after just learning about coral. Or, some people may really want to get into the technical side, but for the most part, people are wanting to hear about how other people are being affected or are dealing with this. So when in doubt, if you're trying to get an emotional reaction from an audience, always go with the human side of things.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I don't know. This seems to be just like a formula for documentaries, environmental documentaries, is let's just show the bad part and let's not show the optimism, because I'm sure there are people who have adapted, right? Yeah. People who have done something about it. And you'll see local success stories, or you'll even see a pessimist side of what's happening to this community, and then show how you can really help. Talk about climate change, talk about the effects, talk about either the action or lack of action for governments working on climate change policies. Talk about that, and talk about how, working with the government to implement those policies, or adding pressure to governments who don't want to implement those policies, show of, people who are working with the government to do that. That's where the story comes in. That's where the action comes in. And I wish I was a filmmaker, because that's where I would go. Yeah. That's exactly how I would put the story together. But I don't know if it's a fact that it's easier to say it, but people don't want to see that kind of stuff. I don't know. I really don't know but it seems like, you put in pretty pictures of these images. Like at one point, they showed in New Caledonia, in New Zealand, they showed corals that were dying, but before corals die, they go through this massive fluorescence stage. So they become like, these colors are brilliant. These colors are like bright, bright purple, or bright, bright green, or bright, bright yellow, or bright, bright blue. And you can see it from the air. Like the whole coral goes that, and then it dies. It's like right before it dies. And they were showing the colors, and honestly, from a visual perspective, it was beautiful. It was gorgeous. But does it really make the message? Is that what really makes the message? And my worry is that's what happens when you get filmmakers not talking to people who deal with the local people in marine conservation.
Sure.
Right? You're dealing with filmmakers who talk to the scientists in academia, which highly regarded, but they don't really, they don't talk about the local communities that are affected by this. Think about what's going to happen to the Great Barrier Reef communities when 93% of their reef are bleached. Nobody wants to dive on it anymore. Where most of their economy is tourism because of the Great Barrier Reef. So what's going to happen to all those, live aboard sailboats and dive boats? What's going to happen to them? What's going to happen to the economy that's based on the Great Barrier Reef? They don't talk about that. And that's the disappointing part about this movie. But if somebody didn't know about what's happening with coral reefs, it got the message home, but didn't tell them what they could do about it.
Yeah.
I know you haven't seen the movie, but I'd love to hear sort of what you're thinking, because my voice is shot right now. I need a break.
No, I mean that's a frustrating sort of outcome for, most documentaries that I've seen. At least will give you some sort of hope, you would think, or at least like a current update on what's being done, know? So that's frustrating that this wasn't included. I can understand, if you're a filmmaker or you're someone who's really into sort of the technical side of capturing these bleaching events, that you would want to spend a good amount of time talking about how you're going to do it. And, the conflict of not being able to go with the original plan and having to change it is exciting, but it's not, to me, I would agree with you, it's not worth taking up like you said, 45 minutes of the documentary when you have these communities that aren't even that far from, like, you could go to areas of Australia or New Zealand. You don't have to go across to the Caribbean or to, out in the middle of the Pacific to really find communities like this. So, it just seems like it was an oversight, but an unfortunate one, because that, showing pictures of coral that are bleached is only going to go so far. I think most people will be like, "Oh, that's terrible."
Yeah.
But, again, what can I do about it? And how big of a problem is this really?
Yeah.
Whereas if you focused on the communities that are impacted by it and, addressed some potential solutions, you might have kind of alleviated both those concerns.
For sure. And I mean, they were low, a lot of the locations were, I think that Hawaii was one of the locations, Australia, New Caledonia, and I think there was one maybe in the Caribbean. I'm not sure. Bahamas.
Yeah, so they're already there.
Yeah, they're already there. It's not hard. And the local people want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Right? I'm sure they want to talk about it to get their viewpoint out there, because it gets lost a lot in this narrative. And it's disappointing. I'd like to see, like, you don't really have to put it in big budget production, but I'd like to see documentaries where they talk to local people of what's happening out there. Because that's where the conservation's really done, right? Is talking about local communities who are affected by these changes, right?
Yeah.
And they want to work to better it because they want to better their lives. They don't want to see their lives be changed the way it's being changed. And I think that's a bad point of view. And of looking at it when you do a video. It's great to have these cinematographers. They're amazing. And talk about the technology, that's great. But that shouldn't dominate the narrative. It should be about the conservation of the ocean, because that's what they're really after. So, and I don't think they mean to do this. I just think that's sort of the equation. That's the algorithm for these kind of documentaries. And if you go on the chasingcoral.com website, which we'll put in the show notes, you see, like, I think what the plan is to go, I think this guy, the photographer, wants to go to like 50 coral reef sites around the world that are remote and document them and trying to protect them and see what is going well, what's not going well, how they're being affected, and report back on them. And I think it's a valiant effort because it's more exploratory, it's more science, more data.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's scientific data, you know, but also it's like, let's get into the conservation aspect of this, right? And I understand you need scientists in the movie to say what the problem is and provide the basis of what's happening and the explanation of what's happening to these corals. But you also need to talk to the people who are out there, researchers, conservationists, who are actually working with the people,
Right.
you know, to do the conservation, to adapt, or to stop what's happening, or to do something, right? Restoration or what have you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's sort of my feelings on Chasing Coral, and you know, we'd love to hear if you've watched it, people in the audience, you in the audience, if you've watched it, go to our Facebook group, speakupforbblue.com/group. Let us know what you thought of the movie Chasing Coral. It's on Netflix. If you have an account for Netflix, watch it. If you don't, get Netflix. It's an awesome. They have a lot of different documentaries on there, plus movies and shows. Very entertaining. But and for cheap, I think it's like $8.99 here in Canada. But
pay us for that promotion.
They should pay us for that promotion.
They really should.
They should. It should be our sponsor. But anyway, you know, like I'd love to hear what everybody thinks about not just Netflix, but Chasing Coral.
Don't tell us what you think about Netflix.
Yeah, don't tell us what you think.
We really don't care.
We don't care. We know it's, you know, it allows for movies like this, which I think is great, and the distribution of movies like this, and to keep it up for a long time. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on the movie, and what kind of actions you're taking at home to help reduce your footprint on climate change. We talked about it on Monday, right? And we talked about, you know, using less single-use plastics on Wednesday. But what I really want to hear is I want to hear what you guys think about what you can do at home, what you can do in your community, and how you can work with your government to reduce the footprint on climate change. So that's our show today. It's probably shorter than normal, but not too much shorter. But I think there are pretty important topics to talk about. And Nathan, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. So yeah, we'll talk to you again soon. Appreciate you doing all the work and researching the different articles and finding that connection without even knowing about the connection. I think that's awesome. Yeah, we appreciate everything you do for this podcast. It's you're obviously part of the team, part of Speak Up for Blue, so we love it. But everybody else, thank you very much for listening. You have been listening to the Speak Up for Blue podcast. Go to speakupforbblue.com/group to join our Facebook group. Other than that, have a great Friday. Have a great weekend. Hopefully my voice on Monday will be better. Yeah, we'll talk to you there. Happy conservation.